Hello everyone. It's time for us to have another session of our Luke Bible class. We're glad that you're tuned in with us today. If you want to go ahead and turn in your New Testaments, we are in chapter 14 of the Gospel of Luke. We're going to start in verse 37, and we'll go through the end of the chapter in this session, which takes us through verse 35. I know that there are some people who are tuning in to these Bible classes who are not members of the Center Hill Church of Christ, and just a little heads up to you, a little explanation. Here at Center Hill, the way our Bible classes work is, especially our teens and adults classes, it's a continuous study through a quarter. And what I mean by that is both on Sunday morning and Wednesday night, it's continuous. We don't have two different studies going on, but we have one study. And so we meet on Sunday morning and Wednesday night and just go right on through. So just to continue on with that schedule, I have been posting videos on both Sundays and Wednesdays as we continue to work through our study of the Gospel of Luke. So, we begin today in chapter 14, verse 7, as I said, and as I prepared for this class, I realized, okay, David, you've made a mistake here. I have divided up the Gospel into little sections so that we take these according to my plan, then we'll get through the Gospel before or by the end of this quarter, which is the end of end of May. And so, June, July, May, end of May. Think about that for just a minute. And so as I did that, this is one of the places where I divided up the sections not in the best way. I should have ended our previous class at the end of chapter 13, and that we would have picked up then at the beginning of chapter 14 today for this study. And here's why. I want you to notice this with me. Look back up at verse 1 of chapter 14. It begins, "One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees," and then he continues on with this incident. Now that sets up where Jesus is and what's going on. But I want you to notice now also, though, beginning verse 7. "Now he told a parable to those who were invited." Those who were invited where? Well, to the same dinner that Jesus was invited to at the house of this Pharisee. So same setting, same place, same dinner that Jesus is at. Then we have verses 7 through 11. But now notice the beginning of verse 12. "And he said also to the man who had invited him." So now he addresses himself to this Pharisee, this unnamed Pharisee who invited him to this feast. He had some things to say to him. And then beginning in verse 15, "And when one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him," so another fellow guest at this dinner heard the things that Jesus was saying, and he responded to that. And then Jesus responds to that man. So this one incident provides us with no less 4 different things that Jesus teaches in this setting, which gives us some insight, I think, into Jesus as a teacher. And, a couple of things there. One, Jesus was able to take everything that was going on in this situation, from the person who invited him and their motives for him having invited him, and his compatriots, the people that were in cahoots with him, I guess we could say, as they were watching Jesus carefully. And so there was that. But then there were also those who had come to the feast and how they were behaving, and Jesus seized upon that then to teach another valuable lesson, which we're going to look at here in a moment. And then he has something to say to the man who invited him about whom to invite to a dinner or a feast like this. And then the response, of course, to the man who has something to say about all of the things that are going in her. So Jesus seizes on 4 different things in this one setting to teach these important lessons. Now, you take that and you expand that out to the life and the ministry of Jesus, and how many times was it that in a given setting, that Jesus taught a variety of things based upon the circumstances they were in, maybe the thing that Jesus wanted to teach on this occasion to begin with, maybe about how people were acting on this given occasion, or what somebody's observation was about that. There was so much that could have been written, and it reminds us of what John says. If all of the things that were written that could have been written about the ministry of Jesus, or from the ministry of Jesus, the world couldn't contain the books. And this gives us a little bit of insight into why that is true. And it also reminds us about how selective the gospel accounts are in recording for us the things that Jesus said and the things that he did during his ministry. We're just kind of getting a handful of all that could have been said. And so they are selective, but not only that, the things that are selected are obviously selected for a reason. And so we need to ask that question about not only what happened, but begin to think about, well, why is this selected? Why is this recorded? Because we know that there are other things that were not recorded, but this was. And so we pay attention to those things. So just a lot to think about there, just in terms of the setting, the things that Jesus did and taught in this setting, about Luke's recording of this variety of things from this one particular setting. But now, as we move forward then and look at the text specifically for our class today, we begin to see Jesus teaching about what it means to follow him, the kinds of attitudes and modes of thinking for a person who would be a follower of Jesus Christ. So there's so much going on in the Gospels. So much that as Luke is showing us the true identity of Jesus and who he was and how he demonstrated that throughout his ministry, but then also what Jesus taught to those who would propose to be a follower of his. Now, if that's going to be true, then this is going to have to be true of you. And we get into some of that kind of thing today. So Jesus is at this dinner at the house of a Pharisee. Many other guests have also been invited. And so, beginning in verse 7, he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor. Again, kind of got to get the setting here. The dinner, it may have been that there was a single group of people at this Pharisee's house, and there were definitely places of honor as you were situated at this, and we tend to say at this table. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, other than the fact that it brings to mind our custom of eating a dinner at a table. That is, we pull up a chair and we sit down and we're all surrounding this one table. We've talked about this before, but the tables of this day were very low to the ground. There were no chairs, and a person would recline at the table. And you see that terminology, to recline at the table. And you would recline at the table with your upper body, obviously, toward the table and your feet out behind you. And you would recline leaning on your left elbow, okay? That's how you would recline. And the person next to you may be close enough that they're actually kind of resting on you. That you see that being depicted in the Last Supper, where apparently John, the Apostle John, was even reclining on Jesus at this. So it's just a very different kind of a setting. But in that arrangement, there were places of honor. That is, that either there could be more than one table or more than one setting of people at places, and so there was a table that was a place of more honor, or even around that one table to be near the host, to be near the perhaps the person of prominence and importance that was invited to this table, and so people would try to get into the best position because it made them look good. And that's what's going on here. And so Jesus says, when you're invited, these people are trying to get into the places of honor. When you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, don't sit down in a place of honor. So Jesus takes this setting that is in this private residence, but then he talks about a wedding feast. And a wedding feast would be one where there were lots of people invited, and so there would have been lots of tables, lots of settings for people to be seated at to participate in this meal. And so they would have been clamoring to get to the best table, as it were, there. But when you're invited to a situation like that, do not sit down at a place of honor. That is, don't put yourself in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you is invited, and then the person who invited you asks you, please give your place to this person of greater importance than you are, and then you're going to have to be demoted to a lesser place, and that would be very shameful and embarrassing. So, Jesus says when you're invited, you sit in a low place, so that when the host comes and sees you in a low place, says, no, you don't sit there. You move up to a higher, better place. Now Jesus, well, let's just finish this off. Verse 11, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. You see, Jesus touches on something that's very basic to human nature, and that is that of self-elevation and self-promotion. We want to look good, and we want to be looked upon by others well. We want them to think highly of us. So we can approach that in one of two ways. And one way is then that we can be about the business of promoting ourselves, putting ourselves out there, putting ourselves up and forward ahead of others, with the intent that others then will look at us and they will think highly of, well, look how important he is or she is because of look at the position they're in or the job they have or whatever that might be. Jesus says that's not the approach to take. If you're a follower of mine, then your approach is going to be approach of humility. That you're not going to seek to promote yourself, but rather you are going to be humble about this. And if you are to be promoted, if you are to be elevated, then it's going to be somebody else that is going to do that to you and for you. You're not going to do it to and for yourself. You know, you can be elevated and you can be recognized while still maintaining an attitude and a spirit of humility. And Jesus is teaching us that Jesus is teaching us that we maintain an humble spirit, an approach of humility. And so if that kind of thing is going to ever happen, if any recognition is going to come our way, it's not going to be because we sought it and we promoted ourselves. It's because somebody is going to give it to us, maybe whether we want it or not, but nevertheless, we are able to maintain this state and position of humility. So, Jesus saw these people clamoring for the most prominent places, and he seized upon that with the opportunity to try to teach them, no, seek an humble place. I think it would be good for us to remember the attitude and the thinking of his apostles, that we see it several times. It's brought up to us several times how they were wanting to have the most prominent places in the kingdom, right? They were putting themselves in that position of sitting at his right hand and sitting at his left hand in the kingdom. Same kind of thinking, same kind of scenario. And Jesus teaches us the humility that we need to have. So, he observes that at this dinner, and so he uses that to teach them this valuable lesson. Then, beginning in verse 12, to the man who invited him, he says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So you have a dinner, you have a banquet. Who are you going to invite? Well, it's very natural for us to want to invite the people we like to be around. We like to invite our friends and our families. We like to invite important people, because, hey, by extension, if they're here at my event, then I must be somebody important as well. But Jesus says, when you do that, then they invite you to their event, then you've been repaid. But Jesus says, instead, why not invite the people who have no way of paying you back? Invite the people who are genuinely needy, the poor, crippled, lame, and blind. Why not extend your gracious invitation and your graciousness to these people? And he said, when you do that, you'll be blessed. I think it becomes a very important hallmark in our spiritual journey when it is our intention and desire to be blessed. We want to be blessed by God. And in order to be blessed by God, then we're going to have to be very sensitive to the will of God and the desire of God and to fulfill His purposes. And so just as our God is one who is kind and good to the needy and the helpless and those who in no way can pay Him back, then He would like us to be that way as well, that we are good to those kinds of people and that we'll be blessed because of that. Now, we will be repaid, but it's not going to be in this life. It's not going to be here and now, but we'll be repaid in the resurrection of the just. So, again, this is the kind of attitude and outlook and disposition of those who would be followers of Jesus Christ. They're going to be kind and good to the people who can do nothing for them. Sometimes it's said sometimes that a great demonstration of a person's character is to watch how they treat people who can do nothing for them. I guess kind of an example of that is you watch how people treat a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant, and if they cannot be kind and respectful to that person who is serving them, then it tells you something about the character of that individual. So again, the teaching of Jesus, if you're going to follow me, this is the kind of a person that you need to be. Now, when one of those, we're continuing on starting in verse 15. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." This isn't the only time that somebody, an unnamed person from the crowd, just states something that apparently they believe that will find favor in Jesus' eyes. You go back to chapter 11 and let's see, verse 27. That's not the right text. The occasion was when there was somebody from the crowd who pronounced blessing on the mother of Jesus, and Jesus' response to that was not what one would expect. I actually was looking in chapter 12 instead of chapter 11. It is chapter 11 and verse 27. And as he said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice and said to him, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast at which you nursed." And so here, another person from the crowd, or at this same dinner that Jesus is at, pronounces blessing upon everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. Which sounds fine, doesn't it? But it's interesting that Jesus really doesn't respond the way that we might expect him to respond. But he said to him, and then he gives a parable of this great feast. Let's go ahead and look at that, and we'll come back to this man and his pronouncement of blessing and Jesus' response to that. Okay, so Jesus responds with this parable. A man gave a great banquet, and he invited many. And so when the time of the banquet came, he said to his servant, "Go get those who are invited to come. Come, for everything is now ready." But they all alike began to make excuses. One of them said, I've bought a field, I have to go and see about it, please have me excused. Another one said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen, I need to go examine them, please have me excused. Another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant comes and he reports back to the master the things that these people have said. They've been invited to his feast, and the time has come, and they're also out, just excuse me from being there. And the master of the house became angry. And he says to his servant, "Go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." You go out and you find the helpless people. Now, I think there is a correlation between what Jesus is saying right here and what he has just told the host of the dinner that he is at, that when you invite, these are the kinds of people that you ought to invite: the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame. And so now, in his parable, the master who has prepared this feast and his invited guests aren't coming, says, okay, you go find these very kind of people: the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And so the servant said, what you have commanded has been done. We have done this already, but there is still room at your feast. And the master says, go out to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. So you just go find anybody you can, and you bring them in, and you fill my house. For I tell you, none of those who were invited shall taste my banquet. Okay. So this is prompted by a man who says, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. That's back in verse 15. Now, why did Jesus respond with this parable? How does that correlate with what this man says? And it appears to me that this man, in pronouncing blessing on everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God, was saying that from the standpoint of presuming to know who would be in the kingdom of God and eating the bread and therefore be blessed. In doing so, the Jewish people, by and large, had an understanding of who would be in God's kingdom. We've talked about this many times. I mean, it was prevalent attitude that was everywhere Jesus went, he ran into it, and so it comes up a lot. They believed that as descendants of Abraham, they were God's chosen people, and therefore they were the ones who were going to be a part of the kingdom. Now, in Jesus' parable, those who were invited made excuses about why they couldn't come and be a part of it. Now, the point of this parable is, who is it that finally ends up filling the house of the master for this great feast that he has provided for them? It is the disadvantaged. It's the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind. Those are the ones who are going to be sitting down to enjoy the blessing of God. That is, they're going to be the ones who are eating bread in the kingdom of God. Go out and find anyone and everyone that you can and invite them in to be a part of this. It is those who respond to the open invitation of God to be a part of this that are going to be blessed. There are those who have had the first shot at it, that the first invitees. As far as the Jews were concerned, they were those people. They had first shot at the kingdom because they had been the people through whom God had worked and from whom this Messiah came. Jesus was a Jew. But it's not just by virtue of the fact that you were among those who had the first opportunity. It's those who respond to the invitation that's offered. And this invitation is going out to everyone. So the man says, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Jesus wasn't denying that fact, but Jesus was driving home the point that you need to understand who is going to be a part of the kingdom of God. And it's probably not going to be comprised of those who you think it's going to be comprised of. And that was a message that these Jews needed to desperately hear. They weren't a shoo-in because God was inviting everyone. And the criteria was whoever would respond to that. Now, we're going to finish off the chapter here with these next two segments, starting in verse 25. Now, apparently we're done with this feast where Jesus has been invited and he's taught all these things and used this one setting for these different opportunities to teach. So Luke continues, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and he said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple.'" So I believe that Luke here in this section is driving home the point of trying to get us to understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and to be a follower of Jesus, the way we're going to have to think about things. And here in this section, verses 25 through 33, 3 times Jesus is going to say, he cannot be my disciple. Verse 26, verse 27, and then finally again in verse 33. There are some people who cannot be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And it's not because they're not of the right class, or they're not the right race, or they're not the right ethnicity, or they're not the right gender, or they're not the right this or the right that. That's not what it is. But there are some things that are absolutely necessary of a person who would be a follower of Jesus Christ. And it's based on more than my intent and my desire. It's more than me just saying, hey, yeah, I would like to be considered a disciple of Jesus Christ. Okay, fine. But are you willing to be and to do what Jesus says you must be and do in order to be my disciple? Because if you're not, you cannot be my disciple. There are 3 things that are mentioned here. We've already read the first one. And if anyone comes to me and doesn't hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters, even his own life, he can't be my disciple. The second thing is, verse 27, "And whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me, he cannot be my disciple. For which of you," he's going to give some illustrations here. "Which of you, desiring to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and count the cost?" You figure out whether or not you have enough financial resources to complete this job that you said you're going to carry out. Otherwise, you'll get halfway through and you're not able to finish it, and people will mock you and say, look, this guy, this was poor planning. This guy was not able to finish the work that he started. So you're going to first count the cost of what you're proposing to do. Jesus' point, if you're proposing to follow me, then you're going to have to count the cost of what that means to follow me. Otherwise, you're going to begin and then you're going to quit and you can't finish the course, and you will be the subject of mocking for that very thing. Second illustration. Or what king going out to encounter another king in war doesn't sit down first and deliberate whether or not with his 10,000 men he's able to go out and meet the army that's coming against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and he seeks terms of peace. So therefore, Jesus says, if any of you does not renounce all that he has, he cannot be my disciple. Okay, here's what I think Jesus is driving home and specifically teaching here, is that if you are going to follow me, that is going to require you to renounce everything. It's going to mean that you're going to have to be willing to renounce relationships. That's what I think he's talking about when he says hate his father and mother, brother and sister, and even his own life. You're going to have to renounce your own will and desire. You're going to have to bear your own cross. That is, you're going to have to die to yourself. You're renouncing your own life as not yours any longer. And then thirdly, you're going to have to count the cost. You're going to have to recognize and realize what's demanded of you in being a follower of mine and be willing to pay that price, if you will, if you're going to follow me. Therefore, if a man is not willing to renounce all that he has, he cannot be my disciple. Now, Luke's going to add one more thing to this, and I think all of this ties in together. Verses 34 and 35, salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's of no use either for the soil or the manure pile. It's thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. We're familiar with Jesus' use of salt as an illustration for his disciples. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Here, I think it's being used a little bit differently in that he just simply says salt is good, but if it's lost its taste, if it's lost its saltiness, how can that be restored? I think his point here is if you're going to be a follower of mine, if you're going to propose to be my disciple, then there's going to have to be something about you that's going to have an impact and affect whatever environment it's in. It's going to have to be, excuse me, that you have an impact. You cannot be a follower of mine who has no influence in the lives around you and the people around you. And yet, it's true, isn't it, that oftentimes people, they want to claim, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm a disciple of his, and yet there is nothing about their life that impacts or influences anybody or anything around them. And Jesus says that's saltless salt, that salt that's lost its taste. And it's not good for anything. And so, again, we're getting this picture, this idea of what it really means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and what Jesus says is going to have to be true about you if you're going to follow me. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, that's not the first time Luke has recorded those words from Jesus in his gospel up to this point in time, but he's, okay, listen up. You pay attention to this. This is critical and this is key in being a follower of Jesus. And so, here in Luke 14, we get this point driven home for us about the ideas and the thinking and the attitudes and the dispositions that have to be true of us if we are truly going to follow Jesus. We're going to have to be ones who maintain this disposition and attitude of humility in everything that we do. It's not self-promotion, but we're going to be humble in our approach. It's about reaching out to those who cannot repay us in any way and being gracious and good and kind to them. It's about responding to the invitation of God to enjoy his banquet, his feast. And it's not because of your status or your position or your connections or your associations that's going to do a thing for you. It's about you responding to his invitation. And his invitation is going out to everybody, not to an exclusive group of people. It's about being willing to renounce everything you have. That is, it's not my own. It is all at the disposal of God. It's about being salt and having an impact and having an influence for good and righteousness in the kingdom of God. All of those things must be true. Otherwise, you cannot, Jesus says, you cannot be my disciple. So, Luke in his recounting for us the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus. At times, he makes us stop dead in our tracks and to think very, very seriously about what we're proposing to do as followers of Jesus Christ. Well, we're going to continue. This was our 9th class for this quarter in this study. And we're going to continue on beginning the next video will be posted for this class this coming Sunday. And we'll be looking at chapter 15, verses 1 through 30, a series of 3 parables that Jesus gives there, and among his very most well-known parables is found there. So we're looking forward to that study and hope that you can come and be a part of that with us then as well. Thank you.